misunderstood the point entirely. Now, there's a lot of ideas that are prevalent in the world in which we live today that, if they were true, would cause us to question God. But they're not true. That's what we said about Calvinism forever. Here you've got, if the God of Calvinism, a God who chose before he created the world, certain ones to be saved and certain ones individually to be lost, and a person has no free moral agency as to which category of those people he's in, then that God is undeserving of our worship and respect. But that's not the God of the Bible. That's the God of Calvinism. A God who ultimately, and think about the God of universalism. Well, there's a God who's so wonderfully good and gracious and kind and loving that everybody's going to be saved. Even those that don't want to. They're going to be forced to be saved. Universal salvation. Now, the God of universalism is not the God of the Bible either. So once we come to an understanding as to who God is in reality, as revealed on the pages of the Scripture, and all of his characteristics, there will be no contradictions between those matters. Are we connected, David, or not? We are. We are connected. Good deal. Okay. And then we're going to see here, notice in the part way through this verse, or this little sentence here, paragraph, God is deserving of our praise simply on the basis of who he is, apart from the blessings he bestows. Because God is God, we don't start trying to barter and say, okay, because I'm facing, at least in my way of examining things, I'm facing more bad than good, then he's not deserving of my attention and praise. Well, obviously, you're very myopic in your view of blessings, because you wouldn't even be able to write that down if you were not blessed with the ability to comprehend enough to be able to write down what you're saying. Where'd that come from? Is that the result of an evolutionary process that caused you to develop the reasoning abilities that are surpassing a rock? Well, see, every blessing that we have and the ones that we take for granted are blessings from God. And so when a person starts trying to, as we've oftentimes said, draw a line down the center of a piece of paper and put the bad things on the left side and the good things on the right side, then you never get done writing on the right side. And what you look at on the left side as being so overwhelming and so big is small, ultimately, in comparison to all the blessings we receive on the right side. God, by virtue of the fact that he's God, is deserving of our reverence and respect because he's a perfect God. That's, to say that is to repeat yourself. God has to be perfect or he's not God. Then the second thing, the question of suffering is addressed. Is this concept of suffering, of evil things happening, is that a problem that has been answered and nobody has any problems with that today? No, that'll always be a problem. It always will. There will always be those who look at the turmoil, the confusion, the ungodliness, the unrest, the hatred, the violence. They look at all that and they say, there ain't no way. There's no way there's a God or all this stuff couldn't exist. But what is so obvious is when a person makes a statement like that, they are drawing a conclusion based upon some type of evidence. And what's the evidence they're drawing? How do you determine that something is ungodly? Well, if something is ungodly, that means it's not godly. Well, how do you get a definition of what godly is? Well, it has to be godlike. Now, whoops, can't do that. You can't reason from God to know God. You see, before you can even classify something as bad, then you have to have at least some understanding or maybe misunderstanding as to what good is. Where'd that come from? Did molecules in motion over eons of time allow those molecules to develop a system of right and wrong that is applicable to the whole world? Well, it would have to, if you're going to be able to say something is objectively wrong and something else is objectively right. And so you cannot even identify evil as being evil without there being some standard to determine what the opposite is. What's that standard? Well, it's God's Word. When God identifies what man ought to do, at the same time, He has identified what man ought not to do. And when God identifies what right is, then that which is contrary to that which is right, of necessity, must be wrong. But you can't even get in that discussion without there being some objective standard. Where did that objective standard come from? And of course, we're constantly being told, you know, that we are simply the end result of a long evolutionary strand, and here we are, and we have raised ourselves to the pinnacle of human existence. And have you read the paper lately? If this is the pinnacle of human existence, we're in a heap of trouble. If this is the pinnacle, then I'd hate to see the valley. No, whenever man rejects the objective standard of God, then you end up what we got now. And it ain't pretty. It's not good. I saw yesterday, and I think it's in Philadelphia, and they blocked out the picture of this, an older black gentleman walking along the street, jumped by 7 teenagers from ages 14 to 17. Killed him. Beat him to death. And they got their pictures right there, you know, everybody can know who they are. And of course, one of the things that the officials, the law enforcement officials said was, parents, if you see these kids and they're your kids, call a lawyer and then call us. But in far too many instances, we know that nobody's going to identify them. Because if you identify the hoodlums, then you're going to be the next one that's beat to death. And round and round and round and round it goes. It's sad commentary, but when mankind is left to his own devices and rejects an objective standard, then this is what results. You end up with, in many cities around the country, you end up with the law of the jungle, which is the idea of might makes right. If I have a bigger gun than you have, then I'll do what I want to do. If I have a larger group, you know, Keith Herron had told me that they are no longer allowed to say gangs in Chattanooga. They're groups. Gang is racist. So there's these groups. And so if you've got a larger group than another group, then you get to rule that street. You know, you might even expand your territory.
But it's just so totally ridiculous.
Totally ridiculous. And you wonder,
Put it on a billboard. If you're in a gang, pick a certain day. If you're in a gang by July 30, we're coming to get you, and you ain't gonna like it.
yeah. And it's just, the chaos and confusion is absolutely ridiculous. And well, I'd say, you know, well, but it's getting a whole lot better, but that would be a lie. As a matter of fact, it is so bad that we're not being able to, allowed to even see how bad it is in so many places around the world. And I mean around the world too, because the rot that has affected this country is rotting around the globe at the same time it is here. We just have more access to seeing it here than there.
Throw dirt right in the face. The special on television about World War II veterans and they were old and everything, and they were pointing out, he said, this country is now, it's not the country that I went and fought for.
Is he the one that wept?
That's a slap in the face.
Is he the one that cried? There was one that I saw. I mean, he's like nearly 100 years old, and he just boohooed. They said, man, me and the guys that fought for this country didn't do it for this. It's just devastating. So sad, so sad.
Well, earlier in my life, I lived in Chattanooga, had a ball team. I had several kids down there in North Georgia, North Ross type thing where Lee's was,
Yeah,
you know, where it was. And I used to take those kids home at 1 o'clock at night and not ever have a worry in the world. Well, I wouldn't go down there in the middle of the day now.
no, in a tank.
I mean, it's completely different group of people down there, and it's just, I mean, in a matter of 15, 20 years, it's changed that much.
Absolutely. It is a catastrophe, and it truly is the result of kicking God out of society as far as you can and destroying the family. I mean, that's another sermon, but it is, obviously there's evil that exists in the world, and some people are going to say, well, because all this evil in the world exists, obviously there's not a God, because if there was God, he wouldn't allow it to happen. But yet that same argument could have been made by, and was made by these people here, said, wait a minute, Job, we know that you're suffering because you've been bad. So obviously if you don't come clean on what all bad you've done, then obviously there's no God that's going to hold anybody responsible. Well, that's ludicrous, of course.
Poor man, fell to death if he had a Beretta under his jacket. He could have shot every one of them kids twice and had one left over.
Exactly, exactly. All right. The question of suffering, why doesn't God do something? Why do we suffer? Who or what causes suffering? Not all questions are answered, and they're not all answered in this book. But the principles that allow us to reason about the answer are sufficient. If we needed more information on any subject, then God would have provided us with more information. And so he expects us to use good sense, common sense, which of course is not common, not as common as it used to be, and understand the responsibilities that are associated with the blessings you enjoy, and be able to then deal with it. It's not, all things are not going to turn out like you want them to turn out. That just happens. Even when you've done all the preparation, all the work that was necessary to do your part to see to it that good results, that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to happen. And I'm thinking primarily right now about my garden. I'm not ever going to wait a month too late to put out the garden anymore, but I just won't put one out if it's going to be that late. But then the Japanese beetles will come back. Who let them rascals back in? I thought they was gone forever. No. Here they come back. They see I'm putting a garden down. They say, let's go down there and pester Freddie's garden. Sorry, rascal. So here's his 3 points that Wayne Jackson makes. Man is unable to subject the painful experience of human existence to a meaningful analysis. Now, that's a big sentence there. But that simply means that when people face difficulties, they can't figure it out. Why is this happening? Why am I having to deal with this stuff? It's above the terminology now. It's above my pay grade. Somebody that makes more than me and is smarter than me, please tell me why all these things are happening. Well, it's not as easy as 1, 2, 3. And what Wayne says, man simply cannot tie all the loose ends of God's purposes together. And of course, the final responsibility, as he expresses here, is regardless of what comes your way and regardless of the circumstances and the consequences that come your way, keep on trusting God and everything will be all right, even if what you're having to face might even take your life. You know, if it ruins your bumper crop of tomatoes, ultimately, what does that matter in the final analysis of things eternally? Doesn't really, does it? And many other such things would fit into that exact same category. Then the second thing he says, suffering is not always the result of personal sin. Now, we touched on this a little bit Wednesday night, because it's a common misconception that if people suffer anything at all, that is God who is using the circumstances to punish that individual, which would lead to the conclusion that there is no such thing as time and chance happen to us all, which means there's no such thing as innocent suffering. Well, who really believes that? You know, we looked at the example of John chapter 7, 8, where this man, was he born blind or did his parents sin that he was born blind? Wait a minute. I mean, you're attributing the blindness of this child that was born blind to sin that he committed? How's that work? You talk about inherited total depravity. I guess Calvinism, that'd be an explanation. Or his parents sinned, and so they're being afflicted with a blind child because of their sin. Now, that's not to say that what the mother does while she's carrying the child cannot have some adverse effects and maybe even result in the blindness of the child, but that's not always the reason. That's not the explanation. That's not the way God deals with people. There is such a thing as innocent people suffering. And of course, you know, David had this same question too. Why is it that people that are trying to kill me are doing so good and I'm not doing good at all? That's not right. Well, it's not. It's uneven. But there is a justice that will be served one day. And we'll see the culmination too, that's what his friends were saying to Job too. Now, the third one, suffering may be allowed as a complement to one's spirituality. And what do you mean when you say a compliment? A compliment does what? Goes along with it, all right? Assist in it. It complements it. It's not saying, oh, you're pretty, or, you know, or you sure do tie your shoes nicely. No, that's not it. Or you drive a nice car. No, that's not that. It goes along with. Now, how can it be the case? And of course, we have the living, breathing example here at the conclusion of the book of Job. But how can it be the case that suffering actually is beneficial to the one who is suffering?
Shows what you're made of.
Absolutely. Your character becomes exposed oftentimes during those difficult times. Job's character, well, was Job's character tarnished by this suffering that he faced? Well, of course not. Is he a more glowing individual, even to the point where the devil has to admit, yeah, this is a special guy here? At the end of the book, then the beginning of the book, yep. Thomas B. Warren wrote a book, A Sun and Shield for Troubled Hearts. It's a little bitty old book. And he wrote that book after he'd had heart surgery and all this bunch of stuff, these physical setbacks that came his way. And so he goes through that book and uses examples such as the book of Job to show the benefit that can be derived from suffering. When you're suffering and there's nothing you can do about it, the doctors can't do anything about it. Doesn't matter how much money you've got, you can't buy yourself out of suffering. Then you're to the point where, as many people were during the Depression, the Great Depression, there was nobody else to look to for comfort than God. Couldn't look to the bank. You couldn't look to your material wealth. You couldn't look to anybody but God. Sometimes that's the only time people look up is when they're flat on their back. Well, the sooner you get flat on the back, then the better off you're going to be, spiritually speaking. And is that not in accordance with what the apostles were taught by Jesus? No. That if you follow the example of Jesus, then are you going to be spiritually benefited by realizing that so much of this peripheral stuff that ultimately doesn't amount to anything at all doesn't carry as much priority, or at least it shouldn't, and is not as valuable as the spiritual relationship you have with God? That's number one, and all this other stuff is way on down the line somewhere. And was it not Jesus as well that warned, what is a man profited if he gains the whole world and loses his own soul? What is a man, and take it from another standpoint, what true loss is a person faced if he loses everything he's got but still saved? He's still in a pretty good shape, ain't he? Best shape possible. Now, if you had your druthers, you'd rather not lost all your money, but as long as your soul's intact and you're in fellowship with God, then that matters. That's what matters the most. That's ultimately all that matters. Did not the wise man Solomon at the end of his little old book of Ecclesiastes say, let's hear the conclusion of the whole matter, fear God, keep his commandments, for this is the whole of man. He didn't say, have a great big retirement and leave a whole lot of money to your kids and have millions of people to come to your funeral and put your name on a bunch of buildings to let your philanthropy be known far and wide. He didn't say none of that. He said, fear God, reverence and respect God, do his bidding. That's the reason why man exists. Everything else would be just extra. And Job understands that to a degree at the beginning here, but he's going to understand it even more deeply later on. And then the next point, the book paints a beautiful picture of patience. The word that is translated patience in the New Testament is hupomone, which describes the trait of one who is able to abide or stand up under the weight of trials. And so when you see the patience of Job, that's what you're talking about. I heard somebody say, well, I think this was Jim Boyd that said this too. He said, some people think patience means standing in a long line at Walmart and not getting agitated. Now, if that's the lengths to which, and the only lengths to which a person is patient, I don't know if that's really the idea of being able to hold up under trials. Maybe you ought to go over and just check yourself out, or maybe you just might need to go to Kmart, or is there even Kmart anymore? Is that patience? Well, it could be. I have before. I'll tell, I used to pray for patience and then end up with kids, and I quit praying. I got them, but I didn't. That's not what I asked for. I asked for patience, but there has to be patience involved in that. And we'll see that in spite of the calamity that was faced by Job, he remained faithful to God, in spite of that. And so to segment it off to waiting in line and not saying open up another line, that's not hardly the idea, although that is patient. And then the last point from Brother Wayne Jackson, the book also prepares the way for the coming of Jesus Christ. And what's interesting, as far back as this is, we're saying this book was written during the patriarchal age, so we're going way back into the book of Genesis, that even way back then, people had not as clear a concept, but a concept of a coming release from this world and all of its sorrows, and a home in heaven made possible by a Redeemer, a Messiah. And of course, you know, I'd like to have been around and heard some of the discussions that those individuals had based upon what they'd received by way of information from the fathers as they communicated God's will to, as heads of the family, to the rest of the families. And we mentioned, of course, Genesis chapter 3, verse 15, and as God spoke to these heads, and as we see, as we'll see in the book, here's Job, who's serving as the priest of his family. He's interceding in behalf of his family. Then all of the information that was available to him is not specified to us. And we might say, well, I'd like to have a little bit more of that information, but we don't need it, or else we would have it. That's what we have to take comfort in. Now, at the bottom of the page, there's a little quick, little old outline. It'd be good to just see what's coming up as we go through this study, because we're going to have the problem that arises, and then all of the conversation that goes back and forth between Job and his three so-called friends. And but let's very quickly then, let's see if we can remember our question, the answer to the questions that we've done cover this. When we talk about Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Solomon, those are not referred to as history books, which doesn't mean that there's no history involved, but this, as far as calculation or designation as to what they compose, what do we call those 5 books? Books of what? Of poetry. And then there's another concept associated with it too, sometimes used, wisdom literature. Okay? Now that's not saying that the rest of the Old Testament doesn't have any wisdom to it, but this is more specialized. And if you were taking a class on the poetical books or wisdom literature, then it would involve maybe all 5 of these, or at least part of these, in a study. Number 2, who wrote the book and when did they write it? Well, the secret things belong to the Lord, but the things that are revealed belong to us and our children forever. Deuteronomy 29:29. In other words, we don't know. We don't know. We don't know who wrote it. We don't know when it was written, but that really doesn't matter. The significance is that it was written, it is inspired, and the message of it is as far-reaching as all the way from the patriarchal age until the end of time. That's why we've got it. Number 3, what evidence is there that this book describes an event that actually really did occur? How do we know, and what evidence is there, that this is not just a myth or a legend or just a fancy little story that was devised by the imagination of men?
Jesus talked about Job, indicated it as a real event.
All right? If you have other inspired writers referencing Job as a historical figure, that's pretty good indication that Job was a historical figure. And if he was a historical figure, and these inspired writers mention that, of course James does. He's mentioned Ezekiel along with Abraham, along with Moses and Daniel and other Old Testament worthies. If you're going to remove Job from the conversation as really existing as a real human being and not just as a myth or a legend, then you're going to have to get rid of Moses too. And you're going to have to get rid of Daniel. Well, who's going to do that? Well, it'd be silly to. And increasingly, when we see the uncovering of ancient civilizations over in the Middle East, then every time that there is a discovery made, it reinforces what the Bible has said all along. No contradictions whatsoever. And so Job, Daniel, Noah, and of course the same ones who would say, well, this is just a mythical story. You can't be really taking seriously anything like this happening to a fella like Job. Then there would be the same ones who would say, yeah, you can't really take seriously there being a worldwide flood and Noah building a big old ship like that. Well, both of them find testimony from inspired writers, including the Lord, of their existence. Therefore, they were real live people. Remember, too, when you think about the beginning of the human race, it was Jesus that said, Matthew chapter 19, that as he quotes from Genesis chapter 2 verse 18, that in the beginning he made them male and female. Oh, me. In the beginning of what? In the beginning of the human race, the beginning of time, the beginning of man's creation. He made them male and female, created man and woman, and a man would leave his father and mother, cleave to his wife, they twain be one flesh, what God's joined together, let man put asunder. That's all quotation Jesus makes from Genesis chapter 2. So if Jesus could quote from Genesis chapter 2, that if that does not sustain the veracity, the trustworthiness, and the historical facts of the case as recorded in Genesis chapter 2, then what would? So the idea of, well, it's not that I don't believe the Old Testament. It's not that I don't believe the New Testament. It's that I don't believe the Old Testament. If you don't believe the Old Testament, you don't believe the New Testament. Because the New testifies to the truthfulness of the Old. Number 4, in what historical time frame, I have to answer this, is the story of Job possibly set? All right. After the flood, during the patriarchal age, when the heads of families were the representatives of God for their families. They served as the priest of the families. And so that would put him as a contemporary of such Old Testament worthies as Abraham, Isaac. He lives in that time frame. Number 5, to what purpose, what is the purpose of this book as suggested in the introduction? To answer what question? All right. How should the righteous suffer? It's not that why is there suffering? It's how am I supposed to face suffering as a faithful follower of God? Because there's going to be suffering. There's going to be difficulties that are associated. So how should I conduct myself? What should be my mindset as I'm facing these difficulties? And then there is 3 main divisions there according to outline suggested. If you're using D's, the first 3 chapters, Job's distress. The 4th chapter to the 37th chapter, Job's defense. And then the last 4 chapters, or last 5 chapters, Job's deliverance. And that is just a general working outline of what we'll be seeing. Any comments on that introductory stuff? All right, we'll get our feet wet just a little bit then, going to page number 8. The objectives we're going to try to accomplish, setting the stage for this great controversy. And this controversy, of course, you'd think, well, surely they could have ironed this thing out, in a few hours, and yet it drags on and on and on and on. Well, one reason why it drags on and on and on is because the suffering of Job drags on and on and on and on, That's one of the reasons. If it was a 24-hour bug, then it had been over and done with, but it wasn't. It was more encompassing than that. And we'll also be looking at, in this objective, to consider the challenge that Satan made concerning Job. Would God have as much confidence in our faithfulness as he had in Job's faithfulness? Well, we could probably answer that, If it was the devil that was issuing a challenge to God concerning me, would God have been so forward as to say, go ahead, take it, see what you can do with it? Pretty personal, isn't it? And then number 3, to appreciate the integrity of Job in the midst of his great suffering. In other words, it's more than just a nice little idea that Job was a man of great patience. Man, he really faced it. I mean, he had big time problems. And when you look at the things that he faced and the glowing end result of his life, and then you think of who would be somebody other than the Lord in the New Testament that would fit into the same category of terrible punishment and persecution. Saul would. I mean, when you think of what Paul, and then Paul could say with truthfulness, I have learned in whatsoever state I am to therewith be content. You got to be kidding, Paul. Yeah, he could actually say that. And he wasn't stretching the truth at all. He had learned that. All right. We will start here, the Lord willing, next Sunday morning. Because Wednesday night, I have prior commitments. And hopefully it'll be a whole lot cooler at camp, but I'm not expecting that to happen. Thank y'all so much.